Hey guys, how's it going? Jay Sensational here, and back out again today with another deck guide on one of my favorite and probably one of the strongest decks in the meta right now. It is the deck that got me to Masters with an astounding 17-3 record. And so I'm very excited to share the deck with you guys. I think it's a deck that if you learn how to play properly, it's going to be very hard to lose with this deck. And that deck is no other than PLC, which is Trundle Lissandra Control. And this will be the Spectral Matron deck that uses cards like Fading Memories. So let's just jump right into it. And before we do that, sorry, actually, plug myself. Make sure to subscribe, like the video on YouTube, do all that jazz. And it really helps me out, really motivates me to do more. But enough of that. Let's go. All right, so let's talk about the deck list. So Trundle Lissandra Control. Of course, that includes 3 copies of our champions Lissandra and Trundle. This being a slow Freljord SI deck, we get to run all of the control tools that both of the regions offer. And especially with the Shrima expansion, we got a really powerful control tool, that being Blighted Ravine, which is kind of like an avalanche, but kind of serves a different purpose, and it also allows you to run 4th, 5th, and 6th copies of Avalanche. Beyond that, we do have 2 copies of Vile Feast, 1 copy of Flash Freeze, 3 copies of Avalanche, 2 copies of the Box, 3 Whales, 3 Vengeances, and 1 Ruination. So you can see where this is kind of going. We have all of the control tools in this deck. This is probably the 2 best regions historically in Legends of RuneTerra for control tools, and we have jammed them all into this deck. So now you may ask, well, with all these control tools, what exactly is the payoff? And I'm glad you asked, because again, with the Stream expansion, we got Lissandra as a champion. And Lissandra is kind of the perfect thing that this Freljord SI deck really needed. It's a very strong early to mid game stall card with its toughness and its level up condition being able to increase their survivability, but because it also gives us the Watcher when it levels up, we now have a win condition that can win on turn 8 or turn 9. Beforehand, we had to play Field Rush on turn 9 and then swing and then Atrocity on turn 10 or things like that. And so our turn to win has been moved up by 1 or 2 turns. And most importantly, this combo does not get denied by either deny or even right of negation, which is the Shrima deny that we got in this expansion. So let's take a closer look at the combo. So what exactly is the combo with this deck? This deck is built in a way to help you turbo out your Watcher. And by doing this, we need to level up Lissandra, and then that creates the Watcher in hand, and then we can play Spectral Matron on our Watcher to push it out. So the way that this deck is built, this is kind of how you do it. We play Trundle, then we play Ice Pillar into Fading Memories onto the Ice Pillar. And so after you play the second Ice Pillar, you've leveled up Lissandra. And this is very important because these Ice Pillars are actually 0 mana, because they refill they refill 8 mana. And by the time you play your second Watcher, if you happen to have a Lissandra already on board, you get the Watcher in hand, and then on that same turn, provided you have the board space, you can then play Spectral Matron onto the Watcher, and this will not only put an Ephemeral Watcher onto the board, it will also reduce Watcher's cost to 0. So very effectively, you can have 2 Watchers on board if your opponent somehow manages to interact or deal with one of them. And this is a very powerful combo because this pretty much guarantees that the opponent loses on the next round unless they have a way to shuffle cards back into their deck, either by, say, playing a champ spell if they have a champion on board, or if they're playing some other shuffle cards like Iter or like Go Hard or like counterfeit copies. But those don't actually see much play in the meta right now, so it's primarily only really if they have a champ spell. And so while playing this deck, you also have to be a little bit cognizant if they have a champion on board that you might want to kill their champion beforehand. But even if you don't and they shuffle it back in, you're still summoning 2 Watchers, which are 11/17s, and they still have to survive that initial attack. So not only are you threatening to beat them with the Watcher, you're still developing a lot of stats on board on this combo turn. And of course, you have a level Trundle, you have a level Lissandra, and you have a lot of tools to really just destroy your opponent's board. And so this deck has very, very many ways to win the game, but this Watcher is a very safe and primary way of doing so. The next thing that I want to talk about is probably the most fundamental and important aspect of this deck. Putting aside the combo, because this deck has been built in several different ways, either with the Matron version or with like a Ledros finisher. Those all have slightly different endgames, but they all have the same way of getting there. And that's by playing all their removal cards, playing their control cards, and making sure that they can clear all boards and survive until they can execute their combo. And the best way to do that, and the fundamental way that players really need to understand when playing this deck, is to set up removal for it. And what that means is your opponent either has to play into a fast speed removal by open attacking, or they play into slow speed removal by developing. And this is what we mean by forks. In the fast speed removal side, we have cards like Vile Feast, Withering Wail, Vengeance, Box, even Three Sisters and Flash Freeze to punish the opponent for open attacking. On the other hand, for slow speed removal, we have cards like Avalanche, Blighted Ravine, and Ruination. And these cards are very important because obviously you can't use a slow speed during combat, or you don't exactly want to commit your fast speed when you can commit your slow speed, for example. And so you have to be very, very aware of not only your hand state, what cards you have in hand, how you want to play removal cards in the next few turns, how much damage you can tank so that you can set up a better removal for a wider board the next turn, and things like that. So, for example, when your opponent open attacks, you can play Withering Wail, and when your opponent develops, you can Avalanche instead to clear the board. And so you always want to be sitting at a comfortable spell mana total that you can do whatever it takes to punish your opponent for either open attacking or for developing. And this is very, very important. So, for example, if you have 9 mana up, you don't want, and your opponent is attacking on the attack turn, if their opponent's board is weak and you feel that they need to develop into this attack, you are going to pass because you have Ruination mana up. And then if they decide to open attack and commit to a weaker attack, even if you don't have the fast speed removal to deal with the board, you've kind of done your job by stalling that turn. This is a very, very important concept that'll be a lot clearer in some of the games that I will showcase for you guys. But this is kind of the tip of the iceberg in setting up forks and really effectively using your removal spells, because you can't just spam your removal spells hoping they're going to clear the opponent's board, and then you run out of cards and your opponent still has a board. One of the last things I'm going to talk about here before we jump into some games are the matchup spreads, because I said that this deck is probably one of the strongest decks in the game right now. And on screen right now, I have some of the most popular decks on ladder that I think pretty much comprise LOR of its meta right now. And those being TF Fizz, Fior Shen, Aggro Piles, and Target Piles. So first off with TF Fizz. This is a very heavily contested matchup that that has people saying it goes both ways. But because I think that TF is, well, in reality, both decks are very, very hard to play. And if you are better at playing one or the other, then the person better at playing their respective deck will have an edge, of course. But with the addition of Blighted Ravine to this deck, being able to act as a fourth, fifth, or sixth Avalanche, I think that TLC will have a 55 into 45% win rate in this particular matchup. But again, you have to be very, very skilled with the deck that you're playing. If your opponent is better at TFIs than you are, then maybe they have an advantage. If you are better at TLC than they are, then you'll have an advantage, things like that. Against Fior Shen, This is another very interesting one because TLC is now cutting a lot of their slower cards and you are no longer running cards like Feel the Rush. You've maybe cut down on Ruinations. Their denies don't actually have that much value left over because now your kill combos are matrons. So you circumvent their denies. And so their deck loses a little bit of that power level. But again, decks that can rally against control decks will usually have a pretty significant advantage into them. In this case, I think Fior Shen is a 45-55 matchup with a slight favor into Fior Shen. Now, one card that really made a difference in this matchup is, of course, Blighted Ravine, because now comparing Blighted Ravine to Avalanche, if you cast Avalanche, they can just play like a Sharp Sight to protect their unit. But because Blighted Ravine is at round start and buffs go away at round end, your Blighted Ravine will still deal 2 damage to all units, and this can clean up their Green Glade Caretakers, or even like a damaged Fiora or Shen. And so Blighted Ravine is one of the cards that can really made this matchup a lot better. Next up, we have your classic aggro piles. This is your Lucian, this is your Azir burn deck that Swim made really popular in the past couple of days. This is your Thresh Gnosis deck. This is your Overwhelm decks. This is your any other deck like that. This is the deck that TLC really takes a dump on because we just got so many more removal tools, and now our win condition is a lot faster. If our win condition was 1 turn faster than it already is, we might even be an aggro deck, but we have all of the early game control tools. And so these aggro decks will really suffer having to be forked into all of our removal. Do I play around Box? Do I play around Avalanche? Do I play around Whale? This is really tough for an aggro pile to deal with, and what makes our matchup so good. Of course, I clump them all into one of these piles, but you can expect a 60 to 70% win rate into most different aggro decks out there. Lastly, I have your classic Targon piles. This is your Aphelios decks, this is your Zoe decks, this is your Zoe Karma decks, whatnot. Um, I didn't include Zoe Lee Sin on here because that's kind of its own animal, but I'll also quickly touch up on that. I think into Targon piles, this is kind of a 50-50 matchup for TLC. The reason being is that Targon actually has the tools to stop your Watcher combo. If they Equinox one of them, then obliterate another one, or if they just Gravitum your Ephemeral one, you can quickly run out of a win condition if you don't have multiple copies of Fading Memories to hit either Watcher or your Matron. And if your Watchers get removed and you have no other way of generating Watchers on board, these Target piles will actually just win the game. Because they have cards like Veiled Temple, they can get a pretty significant advantage in the mid game as well. But of course, if they aren't able to stop your Watcher, they're still susceptible to the same thing that every other deck is. And so I would put this at probably a 50-50. And again, this kind of depends on how the turns go out. If they are very aware of how they win the game by stopping your Watcher or killing you before then, it can swing both ways again. Lastly, I will touch up on Lee Sin. Again, Lee Sin is the slightly faster combo deck. If you don't have the freezes, if you don't have the end tombs, if you don't have the ways of stopping Lee Sin can still kick you to the face by turn 7. And that's slightly faster than what our deck can do. It's still a winnable matchup because we do have cards like Flash Freeze, we do have Three Sisters, even Entomb, Vengeance, Biofeast to pop Bastions, things like that, can swing the matchup in our favor. So we have to play very carefully around this Lee Sin card. But that's matchups, and with that, I'm going to go into some of the games I have for you guys. The 2 deck showcase games that I have for you guys are against Ash Nox and against Fizz TF. Both games I think will showcase a relatively smooth gameplay of being able to get Lissandra leveled, getting Matron into Watcher, and just landing the win condition with Watcher. But turns 1 through 7 will showcase the complexity and difficulty of this deck, and I hope that these 2 games will really showcase one against a mid-range deck where their units won't just die to an avalanche, and then 2, the strongest deck in the meta, probably Fizz TF, how to effectively use your removal and when you want to do it. And with that, I hope you guys enjoy the games, but this is the conclusion of the deck guide portion. If you liked it, if you learned something new, please tell me below in the comments. And I hope that you guys enjoy. But with that, I'll leave you with the games, and I'll catch you with the next guide. Okay, so the game here is against LeBlanc Ashe, which is the new Noxian Ashe pair. So instead of running like 2 Sejuani or like 3 Riven, that slot has now been replaced by LeBlanc, which makes a lot of sense with all the reputation stuff. So just thinking about this matchup in general, this is probably one of the harder matchups deck. In this matchup, they are a very strong mid-range deck whose units don't really die to cards like Avalanche, Biofeast, Withering Wail, things like that. And so if you have a bunch of 5/5s or like 4/4s or get buffed by Avarosh and Hearthguards, their units become really, really hard to remove. And you're only running one Ruination in this deck to really chum out of board states where you're really behind. And so in this particular matchup, you're looking to really either stack removal cards, kind of save them up early on, and then stack like double Avalanche or Avalanche Blighter Ravine together to clear a board of like 5 health units. And then secondly, you're trying to kill them on turn 8 or 9, and so you really need your champions early on. Fortunately for me, my opponent has drawn really slowly. They've missed their turns 1, 2, and 3, in which they could have developed like a 5/1 and a 3/3 that could mean a lot of trouble. But because they weren't able to develop early on, I get a save and stack my removal. And it also gives me time to kind of execute and draw some like combo pieces. Like I had time to play Bjerg there, which allowed me to draw Matron. But onto this turn, he starts off with a Trifarian Glory Seeker. I believe that's what it's called. And this is kind of like the first decision. I can Avalanche, then set up like a 1 health unit on the Ashe, but he still has 3 mana and can develop further. And so I think taking a Vile Feast here is kind of just good enough. This is probably one of the only instances where Vile Feast can get value unless you're stacking it on top of like an Avalanche or a Blighted Ravine. And if he wants to say save it, and then he challenges the 3/3, and I can block the Ashe with the Spider, I can then just Avalanche the Ashe afterwards. And so having a 1/1 blocker for this Ashe is really good. Turns out he has another one, which is fine. I could have passed to see if you wanted to play the second one, but if I did, I wouldn't have this 1/1 Spider to really set up like a removal on the Ashe later on. And this is something you have to be thinking about when playing this deck. You have to be thinking about turns ahead, how you want to be using each removal card in your hand. And the opponent notices this and even forces out a Brittle Steel onto the Spider just to protect Ashe from going down to 2 health. Another thing to kind of learn about this deck is just figuring out the breakpoints. A lot of your cards deal 2 damage, a lot of your cards deal 1 damage, but very few of your cards deal 3 damage. We do run Bach, but that is super situational and doesn't always work. And this Avalanche is a little strange. Just setting up the Ashe down to 1 health is kind of valuable, and it just lets me kind of set myself up for the next couple of turns. So I got somewhat rewarded there because he gets 1 less card from the Assessor. And this turn looks a little bit interesting. I think that a lot of players might get baited into spending mana on Trundle a little early. So like last turn, I probably couldn't play Trundle on 5, and that would have left me a little mana. Because he plays Assessor here, which is a very slow tempo turn for him, it kind of gives me the option to play Trundle. Because in my hand, I already have Lissandra Fading Matron, and that's the combo piece that I need to just win the game on the spot. And so I actually needed to play Trundle on either last turn or this turn. And that's also another thing you need to be thinking about with this deck, is just when you have, because with this deck you need to play Trundle and you need to play Lissandra before you can even get the combo off. And this avalanche is good because it threatens the ash, but because he troll chanted afterward, I now have the whale to put on top of it. And this is really good because it clears 2 units. And that was pretty much his whole turn. Next turn, I can pretty much just really develop and then threaten with the combo on my next attack. And so on a clock, my opponent has at most 2 attacks to kill me. And I could just sack the Trundle here. The Trundle actually isn't doing me anything here. But because their deck doesn't really run any attack buffs, this Trundle can actually trade. And if I trade now versus block last turn, then I get to remove a unit on board and have Trundle as a block for the next turn. And if that doesn't go to plan, I still have like a Blighted Ravine. And so this turn, I make sure that I can set up the combo and go for the kill next turn. And by doing that, I need to play 2 pillars. And of course, this also threatens his Ash with my Trundle. One last thing to keep in mind with this game, especially against decks that can remove Lissandra, those being either like Shadow Isles decks that run Vengeance, these Noxian Ash decks that run Coaling Strike, or even like PNZ decks that run Thermo Beam. If your Lissandra dies and you rely on the Watcher as a win condition, this can be very, very detrimental. I've had games where I've played Lissandra on 3 against decks like Ash Nox, and they've cold my Lissandra before it leveled, and I had to dig through another half of my deck in order to find the other Lissandra, and sometimes if I don't, I just lose the game. A very cool interaction here with the Blighted Ravine and with Trundle is that Trundle regents at end of round and Blighted Ravine activates at start of round. And so your Blighted Ravine will never kill your Trundle, which is another really cool interaction to note. Of course, in this matchup, his units have at least 5 damage most of the time, and setting Trundle to 4 means that it's not a good blocker, but I was able to trade pretty well on the attack turn last turn. And this is looking pretty grim for our opponent. I have the Matron Watcher combo next turn, which lets me to put 2 Watchers on board. And the only thing I really need to be cognizant of is the fact that I need 2 board space. If you notice, this combo requires me to have 4, needs like a 4 board space setup, or even 5 if you count the turn before, because I couldn't actually execute it on last turn if, for example, I had played Lissandra earlier. But because I set up this on the next turn, my combo was 1 turn slower, but it does guarantee me that I can pull it off. And in this case, I don't really care if Lissandra dies. I win by playing the Watcher next turn, and I have 2 Watchers in case he has like a freeze coal or anything like that. And there is some weird instance where like he does like a Harsh Wind's Reckoning type of thing, but because he has to deal with 1 Watcher at a time, he doesn't really have a good way of interacting with that. And again, if I played Lissandra here, I'd have 1 board space, and you have to be very cognizant of it. If I played Lissandra last turn, I can't play Matron into Watcher. And this is a pretty good textbook example of how this combo works out. If you notice, this is turn 10, so combo was 2 turns slower than it could have been, but just playing it safe out there, making sure that you get it right, make sure you have board space, and just making sure you have control of the board is so important. Alrighty, and now we're moving on to everybody's favorite matchup. That is against TF Fizz. Now, I did mention that I think that a good TLC player will be okay TF Fizz player. I think at the very highest levels, TF Fizz will have an advantage if they land a suit up onto like a Fizz early on, because this deck kind of has a hard time dealing with that exact combo. But in this matchup, you are pretty much just looking for all of your removal. You want your avalanches, you want your blighted ravines, you want your removal, everything like that. And you can pretty much just toss anything away. Your combo pieces really don't matter if you don't survive to the turns that you can play them. And usually it'll be very hard to sneak in moments to actually play your combo piece on curve. In this particular instance, however, our opponent seems to be off to another slow start, passing the first 3 turns, and this kind of allows me to play Lissandra. In some very weird instances, this 8/8 that comes out of the Frozen Thaw might actually make an appearance, and because my opponent's taking just such a slow time, I think that I feel pretty confident. And you'll notice this play from the opponent very much. He starts with a pick a card and floats 4 mana, and they wait to see if you decide to tap under so they can play TF. And this is the start they have to realize. They had a slow start. The only way back into this game is if they stick a TF and level it. And so in this case, I have to kill Twisted Fate. Luckily, I do have 2 Blighted Ravines and 2 Avalanches to make use of this. But this was not a turn to play Bjerg after he pick a carded. You can never do that. Just to be clear. So now the only choice there was, do I play Avalanche or do I play Blighted Ravine? And that's an interesting question because I have 2 of each. It didn't really matter. I used Blighted Ravine here, even though I don't get any heal out of it, because Avalanche can be used on the same turn, right? If they decide to play a couple of elusives, Avalanche has a little bit more value than Ravine here, and so that was kind of the thought process going into which card I used there. Again, he plays Twisted Fate, blue cards, has 2 fleeting cards still, and is on pick a card mana, and so again, if they level up Twisted Fate, this is probably one of the ways that I can lose this matchup. So I pass. I have ways of removing this Twisted Fate, and I am not scared of him just passing this turn because he still has 2 fleeting cards as well. This is another thing they have to be very cognizant in this exact matchup, is when they play pick a card and they have fleeting cards, you should feel a lot more comfortable taking these passes. And again, he goes for the Twisted Fate pick a card, and I play an Avalanche to kill this Twisted Fate. Because again, if they level Twisted Fate, you cannot allow that. And so, goodbye Twisted Fate. Another very something that you need to be worrying about is if they have Stood Up. In this case, they had 0 mana and they tapped under, but if they were representing Stood Up, you have to be a little bit more careful there. He burns a Burble and a Rummage. So at this point, he's used he's burned 1 Rummage, used 2 pick-a cards, and has all 3 TFs for that matter. But now you can be wary about his reach with Twisted Fate. Because he's down 1 Rummage and 2 pick cards, his ability to level up Twisted Fate has diminished very significantly. I still want to be careful because, again, I can slow play this, right? He has fleeting cards, he's still playing for this Twisted Fate level up, and so I just on-treat to get my card out, which is Trundle, because I'm still looking to how I want to win this game. The craziness about their deck is that they can still win from games like these because now their Burbles are almost costing 0. They did burn 1 Burble. They've used 1 Suit Up here, but it's not the end of the world for them just yet. But luckily, I do have this last Avalanche in hand, and this is also where I need to be a little bit careful. This is my last piece of removal in hand, and if my opponent somehow makes a board state that kind of beats just 1 Avalanche, then I might lose. I'm still like 2 turns away from a combo. I need to play Trundle, I need to play Double Pillar, and I don't even have Matron in hand yet. But leveling up Lissandra does wonders against this matchup because now each of their elusives deals 1 less damage. He makes an open attack with the TF, which I think is probably right, but because he did that, this allows me to play Trundle. If he had developed a board, for example, I can't play Trundle. I might be pressured into this Avalanche. But because he just didn't really develop any pressure at all, this Trundle is pretty free. Now, I still need to be wary about this Twisted Fate. I need to kill it before he's able to level it, and I was kind of waiting for him to commit just a little bit more to the board, and there was a reason to maybe use it next turn, for example. He was already down 2 rummages, he uses stress testings. I could have baited out a little bit more, but I think that, again, the risk there is that if he levels up Twisted Fate, that's kind of the way for him to get out of this game. But I do have the leveled up Trundle next turn. This will kill the Fizz, and I have a little bit of an inevitability, right? I have Beard, I have Lissandra level, and I have this Fading Memories. And so I can win on my next attack turn, and it's just really a matter of getting there.
Can't say no to Fizz.
What this also does, the second Ice Pillar, is that I can also challenge the Zap Sprayfin. And so these elusives, I can at least remove a couple of them because my hand is really out of removal resources. And of course, this Lissandra is leveled with the second pillar. Now this is kind of a... it's not even an error because I couldn't really have played around it. When you level up Trundle, the Bjergs have a chance of pulling Trundle instead of Matron out of your deck. In this case, I had 2 Trundles and 2 Matrons left, so this was really unlucky on my part, meaning that I can't actually close out the game next turn, or my next attack turn. And so I have to actually stall out a little bit more. Luckily, I do have a leveled up Lissandra, and so I might be able to live through another attack. The reason I didn't play Lissandra right away was that for my opponent, killing Lissandra with like, it'd be really expensive. It'd be like get excited, which probably isn't worth it. That's just 4 damage I miss off my Nexus. But if Lissandra dies and they can redevelop a board, it could mean trouble, especially if they somehow open develop underneath a like an Icequake in hand, because that is literally my last piece of removal. And I am still a little ways away. The lucky part is that Trundle is actually putting him on like a 2-turn clock, pretty much. And I'm feeling okay with this free Ice Shard. I could have snapped the Icequake here, but because I have Vile Feast and Ice Shard, I can kill off most of his board. So if a very important thing to know is that you don't really want to be using your fast speed cards before combat. A way you can kind of get blown out is if you commit your resources before combat, kill like a 3-1 and 2 2-1s or 2 1-1s, but they suddenly have like 2 or 3 iteratives in a hand and just redevelop their board for free. And so you have to be very, very careful. You have to wait, you have to be patient, and save your removal cards until after they attack. Because after they attack, even if they want to iterative afterwards, you're not really getting punished at all. At this point, I'm threatening a 1-turn lethal. I don't really need to develop. It's kind of on him to do something. He decides to get excited in my face, which is a little bit scary, but because I have the Lissandra level, I don't think that's necessarily too much of a threat. If I just double Ice Shard over the next 2 turns, then that can pretty much clear off the majority of his board, and I can just challenge the 4-3 and under it. Now here I make kind of a critical mistake. It's not even the worst mistake, or it's pretty bad actually. I didn't notice that I drew both Fading Memories, and in this case I could have double Fading Memories on the pillar and played Watcher here, which would have just won me the game. But I was kind of tunnel visioned into this Trundle being able to just kill him that I kind of overlooked it. And he did have a way of punishing me, which was, if they survive this turn, they have a chance of killing me next turn. And so pretty much what happened here is I gave them 1 extra attack turn for pretty much for free. On the bright side, because I had to commit to Get Excited to kill my Trundle, it's very hard for them to have the breach to really finish the game. But this is a very critical mistake. I gave them an extra turn for free. You know, I did top deck the Whale there, which completely shuts down his board. I do have like a Flash Freeze. I do have like Fading Memories if I really need to copy like an elusive for a blocker. So I don't think I would lose by any means, but that's kind of not how you should be thinking about these plays. I made a misplay here. I gave them one extra turn to potentially have lethal, even though it won't really matter because I pretty much have answers for anything. It's still just not the proper play. And this Catalyst is pretty much icing on the cake. I have the Ice Shard, I have the Whale, I have 6 healing in hand, I have ways of clearing his board. I don't really mind what he does. He Mind Melts here. I could like a Whale Shard if I want to, but I think I have like 5 different ways to stop this Mind Melt from reaching my face. And so I'm not too concerned here. And I have lethal, you know, I can play the Watcher, I could just kill him on board. There's just no way out for him here. With the Flash Freeze, this is over. I could have even just double healed out of range, but that's obviously risky and unnecessary play. And again, playing with your removal cards very efficiently, knowing when and how you lose and what threats you need to remove off the board, and playing for your own win condition.